Welcome to the Friends of Dan Music Podcast. I'm Dan Miles. Well, that didn't turn out quite the way the Beatles wanted it to, but I think it still has some value. The same can be said for the subject of today's show. We're going to be talking about the Beatles' Saturday morning cartoon series that aired back in the 60s during their prime recording years. A book called Beatletunes, The Real Story Behind the Cartoon Beatles, was published back in 1999 and chronicles every aspect of the series in great detail. Joining me now on the phone from Long Island, New York, is the author of the book, Mitchell Axelrod. Hi, Mitch. Welcome to the show.
Hi, how are you?
Well, let's start out with the obvious question, which doesn't actually have an obvious answer, which is, whose idea was it to animate the Beatles?
Well, it depends on who you ask. Al Brodax still is a brilliant man who came up with the idea, but it really wasn't him who had an idea to animate the Beatles. And there's a couple of different stories going around. When I talked to Al, he told me the story about a man he was working at King Features, by the way, doing the King Features trilogy with Popeye, Snuffy Smith, and Beetle Bailey. And and Crazy Cat, actually. Popeye was separate on that. Mm-hmm. And then he saw a guy come into King Features with some drawings of the Beatles, and the guy said to the King Features editor, "I'd like to put these in comic book form," and the editor said no way, because he had no idea who the Beatles really were or if they would even last. It was 1964, so they were hot at the time, but you never knew they were going to be 45 years later, right, who they are now. So he politely declined, and Al Brodax, as the story goes, followed this man into the bathroom, took a look at the pictures, and said, "Look, I'm in charge of the animation department here. I'd like to get them to move." And they made a deal with, the Beatles lawyer at the time, and got everything in motion. But there's another story where Al told in his book, Up Periscope Yellow, a few years later, after mine, where he said that he saw the Beatles on Ed Sullivan and right away called up and said, I'd like to put them in cartoon form. So, well,
that makes him the hero. That's probably why he revised it.
And then also, to be honest with you, memories fade.
Yeah.
But he did give me my interview, for the record. He gave me my interview before he put out his book. So I'm going to stick with mine. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Sure. And even then, the individual was not named specifically who had the idea to do the comic version. And in fairness to Al Brodax, no matter whose idea it was, he's the one who actually did it. So.
Yeah, and that's true. And it doesn't matter how they became or came into King Features. The truth is that, he was smart enough to make it work however it got to be.
But he originally pitched it as a prime-time show for adults along the lines of the Flintstones.
Right.
How did it evolve into, or possibly de-evolve into, a children's show instead?
Well, and that's funny, because when I found the little article saying that it was going to be in prime time, I was curious, and then somebody at one of the studios at TVC Studio that did the main bulk of the shows, and I guess we'll get into that after, but they told me a story that Tom Moore, who was the head of programming, nighttime programming at ABC at the time, viewed a couple of the roughs of the cartoons. And as soon as he saw them, he said, he was a big cowboy kind of guy, a southern guy, and he said, "No way, ain't going on my network at night." So, you could see his point. Looking back, they're cute and funny, but, they weren't that sophisticated. And the Flintstones were a little better drawn, a little more sophisticated in terms of the comedy. And they were groundbreaking, but there was no way the Beatles were going to be on at night. And turns out that actually was a good thing, because they did so well in the morning.
Right. I was surprised by the relative ease with which he was able to secure a network, ABC, to broadcast the show, and also a sponsor willing to put up over $1 million in 1965 money before either of them had really seen a sample of the show. Did he bring them illustrations, or was it just a verbal pitch he gave them?
Both. He gave them a verbal pitch, but he did bring them the original drawings that the person had brought in from King Features. Don't forget, though, when the Beatles hit big on Ed Sullivan, the dollar signs were in everybody's head right away. So it wasn't that hard to say yes to something that, especially at the time, again, trying to strike while the iron's hot. It wasn't that hard to say, yes to this commodity at the moment, because they knew how big it was. So, that's why they were able to secure it. But that also has a little bit of a pitfall too, because it was Anton Isaacson, who was in charge of the A.C. Gilbert Company, who put up a bulk of the sponsor money, and his big thing was, hey, we got the Beatles, and he announced it to the world in late '64, early '65. We've got the Beatles. It's amazing. We have the plum of the broadcasting season. And, he was famous for erector sets, American Flyer trains, and such. And he really thought that putting his commercials in the middle of Beatles shows would make kids run to the store and buy erector sets and trains. Unfortunately, what happened, for him at least, not for the Beatles, when people saw the Beatles cartoons and the commercials, they didn't really care what the commercials were. They just ran out and bought Beatle records.
Right.
And it really, it literally bankrupted the A.C. Gilbert Company.
I'm sure that the prospect of making big money without having to do any work was very appealing to the Beatles camp. As we'll see, that lack of involvement did create some problems. But first I want to talk about when the show was greenlighted and it was time to start production, Al Brodax recognized that in order to produce the amount of content he was going to need in the time allotted, it would be necessary to subcontract several studios to get all that work done. The studios he ended up using were in England, Australia, Holland, and Canada. So my question is, since the series was conceived and financed by Americans, why were no American studios involved in the animation?
Simple. Economics. It was a lot less costly to make things overseas. All the overseas studios were fledgling in animation. They were doing commercials, not really series at the time. One of them was Artranza in Australia was doing some Popeye, some Beetle Bailey as well over there. So they were doing some series work, but most of the others were just doing really commercial work with animation. So they were starving for anything they can get. So they gave a better price. So really it came down to economics. Well,
throughout the run of the series, the basic format of the episodes never changed. Do you want to give us the rundown on how they were each structured?
Yeah, there was an opening, and there were 3 openings during I'm going to say 4 years they were on. The last year was really a bunch of repeats. But there was an opening. There were 2 5.5-minute cartoons, and sandwiched in between were little in-between bits that led to a message from the sponsor. But really in between were the sing-alongs, 2 sing-alongs, where one of the Beatles, other than Ringo, would try to coax the audience into singing along with their latest song, and Ringo was filling in for the ever vacationing or sick prop man, and all hijinks ensued. So
hijinks ensued.
Yeah. Yes.
So within the same half hour, you might see a cartoon produced in Canada, then 2 sing-alongs produced in England, followed by a cartoon produced in Holland.
Yes.
Was it possible to tell which studio had produced which content just by looking at the artwork, or did they all pretty much stay on model?
Well, they were supposed to stay on model, but that never happened. If you watch, you can tell pretty distinctly which studio did what. If you get a whole of underground tapes or whatever, because the Beatles cartoons have never been released officially, but if you get a whole of those, you can really tell that, to me, my favorite studio was the UK, TVC, but that is not always the favorite of everybody. Australia did quite a bit of them, because the UK did about half of them. Australia did a bunch as well, and then not quite as many as the UK. And then Holland did, I think, 3 or 4, and Canada did about 6 or 7. So, but you could still tell Australia, Ringo's nose was so different in every studio, even though it was supposed to be big and cartoony. There were some times when it got ultra cartoony.
Yeah.
And that even happened in the UK. The UK, TVC subcontracted out as well, even though, they were the main studio. They subcontracted out within the UK to other little studios, too.
Right.
Everybody was doing their own thing. So you can see distinctively, like Canada, they would draw the Beatles really tall and lanky, especially John. And you could easily see that if you watch all the Canadian episodes. So there's certain things to look for to tell, but definitely, everybody was supposed to stay on model, but it never happened.
I wonder if they might have done that on purpose for a point of pride to say, that's my John Lennon right there.
They might have, but from when I spoke to them, it was done so quickly that they didn't have time to really think about what they were doing.
Sure.
I mean, it was done so quickly that one of the animators in the UK actually had a breakdown. So, I mean, it really was done.
Impressive.
I mean, think about it. It was announced in November of '64 that the Beatles were going to be in cartoon form. It was going to be on in September of '65, less than 1 year, and nothing was secured yet. So they had to secure everything and then do all of the episodes, 13 at least, in less than a year, which is unheard of.
Yeah.
And it's not computer animation where you could maybe do it today. All hand done by units and teams of, whatever in each studio.
It's funny you said units, but to me it sounded like you said eunuchs.
Oh, well, it might have been done by eunuchs. I don't know.
Done by monks in the Himalayas. Well, I'm going to make my father proud right now. He was a math teacher. I actually have, this is from your book, so you get the credit, the actual breakdown of how many shows were done where. There were 39 shows, but like you said, each one had 2 cartoons. There were 78 cartoons. 47 of them were done in England, 20 were done in Australia, 6 in Canada, and 5 in Holland.
All right, so I wasn't that far off.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the time slot. Let's see. In Season 1, ABC ordered 17 episodes with the intention of repeating them all twice to fill out the 52-week schedule.
Right.
And why did they decide on the particular time slot?
At 10:30 in the morning was a perfect time slot. It just worked. I mean, too early, and you weren't going to get some of the older people. And too late, and people were doing other things on a Saturday. So 10:30 just seemed the perfect time to have people sit down and have breakfast. And even though to me, I'm an early riser, so I'm having breakfast way before 10:30. But I guess in the 60s, all the family got together and and made their eggs and bacon and everything, and sat down and really watched the Beatles. So it was just later on, as I'm sure we'll talk about, it moved a little later, which didn't help in the ratings. But as it turned out, it was a very astute decision because the ratings were boffo.
I'm sorry, I was going to say it premiered on September 25th, 1965, in that time slot, and the American public's reaction was pretty unprecedented.
Yeah, a 52 rating, a little over a 52 rating, which is unheard of for any show, let alone a cartoon.
You can't even get that with the Super Bowl, I don't think.
No, I don't. No, but I mean, 52 is just an incredible rating for even, like I said, a cartoon. It's just unheard of. And again, that's the power of the Beatles. I mean, you had cartoons, which were perfect for kids, and you had Beatle music, which everybody liked at that. Well, I won't say everybody. Most people liked at that point. But how could you go wrong? So
this was a year and a half after Ed Sullivan, so they'd had Hard Day's Night had come out and a few different albums and whatnot. The TV viewers might have liked it, but the Beatles' own attitude was far less enthusiastic. What was their main objection to the series?
The main objection were the voices. And, I'm going to tell the story about Americanized Liverpudlian, and I cannot really blame Al Brodax. I mean, Al Brodax came up with the idea that this was made for the U.S. market. This wasn't made for any other market, even though it was shown all over the world, except for the U.K., ironically. But I think 45 countries or 60 countries saw this. But it was basically made for the U.S. So he really felt, and it was a conscious decision in the beginning, where maybe, the kids in America wouldn't understand any kind of accent, especially a heavy Scouse or Liverpudlian accent. So he made the decision that it would be an Americanized Liverpudlian, where Paul Frees, who was a god in the world of voiceovers, even today he's one of the biggest in the business ever, God rest his soul. And he picked him to do the voice of John and George, and he picked actually a UK person, Lance Percival, to do Ringo and Paul. It was a conscious decision, and I cannot say he was wrong. It turned out that the Beatles didn't like the voices, but they were still cashing the paychecks, believe me.
Well, let's listen to a sample of what those cartoon Beatle voices sounded like so our listeners will know what we're talking about.
What's on our schedule today, John?
Well, today we visit the man of 1,000 faces, the most famous master of makeup and disguises in all of Hollywood.
Now, that's something worthwhile. I've been waiting to meet him the whole time we've been here. The makeup man, yeah.
Not even a genius will be able to help your face any.
Maybe Ringo will be able to help him. Oh, yeah? How? You could be the model for his new monster.
Well, the argument that American audiences would have trouble understanding Liverpool accents seems a little odd considering the success of the Hard Day's Night film, which featured proudly Liverpudlian dialogue, which wasn't Americanized at all and clearly didn't hinder the reception of that film. In fact, all the clever wordplay that emphasized the fact that the Beatles were distinctly English was one of the more appealing aspects of the film. Do you think it was because the target audience for the TV series was going to be younger than the film audience?
I think there's a good point there. But don't forget, the Hard Day's Night, I know it was made for worldwide release, but the screenplay was done by a British person, and also, or from the UK, and they had made that really, they started filming that in late '63, so I really believe in my heart of hearts that they really thought A Hard Day's Night would be a little tiny film playing for the UK, because
right.
The Beatles were very popular in the UK at that point.
Sure, who else would be interested,
Right, exactly. And, they didn't know they were going to be so big after Sullivan, so I think that was the intention of A Hard Day's Night. So, again,
right.
I really can't blame Brodax for making that decision. It was a business decision, and I think it worked.
I find it interesting that the original 4 writers that Brodax hired ended up writing all 78 episodes of the show. He paid them a flat fee of $400 per script, so it was in their own self-interest to work quickly since they weren't being paid by the hour. The writers of the show, at least some of them, weren't particularly fans of the band, and one of them actually admitted that he really hated rock and roll and only took the job for the money. So do you think this lack of reverence for the Beatles among the writers ultimately helped or hurt the show?
I really can't say, because I don't think it hurt. I don't think they were trying to do anything bad in terms of, just because they didn't like rock and roll. And I think you're talking about Dennis Marks.
I think I am too.
Yeah. So I think, I don't think they purposely, it was a paycheck. They had to, and Al Brodax saw everything they wrote. And if he didn't like it, obviously they wouldn't be writing anymore.
True, yeah.
So I think the money was there. It didn't matter what they were writing. It was definitely, it was exciting afterwards for the writers, because, as I think in the book, there's a story about, I believe, Dennis Marks, who said that he didn't like the Beatles at all, except when it came to the Beatles coming to Shea Stadium. And he said in August of '65, and I have a feeling he might have meant the '66 show, because the Beatles Cartoons were not on yet.
Right.
But when it came to Beatles coming to Shea, his 14, he didn't want any tickets. He got offered as many as he wanted. And I think his 14-year-old daughter said, "What, are you kidding me? You're not going to take any?" And, her and a bunch of friends got to go to Shea Stadium, even though, the writers' favorite, stuff was classical. So, it had its advantages to the families, and, again, the money didn't hurt. They, just like the Beatles were cashing the paychecks, even
right.
the voices. Well, the writers were doing the same thing, even though they hated the music.
As far as the writing, it seems like ABC was virtually a co-writer, because they had the ability to reject content that they found objectionable. You reprinted an actual memo from June 1965 in the book, where the network notes say, "Do not have John jab Ringo with a fork. Please be sure Marguerite is not too sexy, and the electric chair is not acceptable for our young audiences. Serious subjects should not be treated in such a light manner." That's word for word. So, if the writer writes something where John jabs Ringo with a fork, or they make Marguerite too buxom, or they make a joke about the electric chair, the script changes because of ABC. So they're kind of like a censor, but also kind of like a co-writer in a way.
Well, standards and practices for everything.
Yeah.
And that was ABC. But here's the thing. Even though it happened, even though they got those letters, there are instances where things got through, as such as the episode for Babies in Black, where the vampirist in that episode, originally got through, and then was taken back. But they made her chest way too big, and they actually had to reanimate her chest to make it smaller, which they didn't like to do because of the speed factor in which they had to produce them. So a lot of times, things did get through. The only other time, and that was one time. The only other time that there was a change in the actual animation was for the She Loves You episode, which was done in Holland. The knives were considered too big. It's an episode with a knife thrower.
Yeah, it was pretty scary.
Yeah, and I still think the knives were pretty big in the episode, but they were told to make the knives smaller in fear of kids going into their, I guess, cutlery drawer and pulling out knives and starting to throw them.
Yeah.
If they wanted to, they should have actually just banned the episode, not banned it, but not made it, because, if you're concerned about kids throwing knives, I don't care how big the knife is or not. It's the subject matter that they might throw it. But again, we have to remember that cartoons, people were listening more to the Beatle music than watching what was going on in the cartoon.
Well, I want to talk about some of the positive aspects of the series. Even though the Beatles' speaking voices were done by actors, the music was always the real deal. So they'd play 4 Beatle recordings every episode, and the real Beatles' presence was definitely felt throughout the show. They also gave additional exposure to some of the lesser-known album tracks that a casual fan who only knew the hit singles might not have heard otherwise. And they didn't draw a distinction between original Beatles songs and covers, so I'm sure the writers of those cover songs loved having them played to such a wide TV audience, and I'm sure getting paid.
Yeah, I should point out, though, that that wasn't really done to showcase B-sides and fillers. It was done because that's all they had. They really didn't have any other music, so they had to use everything on Beatle albums, which was great. It did have a very big upside, not only on royalties for, people like Arthur Alexander and who did Anna and other writers, but, the Beatles albums were then exposed to, the kids in full, and it became more of album-oriented rock other than just 45s. It wasn't thought of that way, obviously, but again, having only so much to work with, it just became a nice byproduct of that. Yeah,
well, that's what I'm saying. They needed material, and they had to work with what they had, so it gave added exposure to those songs. It benefited those songs, I think, because, some of them that the people who owned the album knew them, but a lot of people didn't own any of the albums, or they only owned the singles.
Right, and people then went out and bought the album.
Yeah, exactly. It was really a 30-minute commercial for the Beatles.
Yes. Which is why A.C. Gilbert folded.
I know their name has not lived on through the ages, has it?
No, Lionel has, but not American Flyer.
And there were some candy bars they were advertising too, right?
Yeah, I think
Mars Bar
Company.
Yeah, that was probably a good fit for kids will go, well, I'm going to get a Mars bar on my way to the record store.
Exactly. More sugar, and then we'll go buy Beatle records and go home and listen to them all hopped up on sugar.
Well, the show actually was very popular with teachers. Why was that?
Because of the sing-along segment. It actually taught kids how to read. The sing-alongs were a really important part because of that. And I will note that the sing-alongs were also a little naughty part, which I'll explain in a minute. But as far as teaching, the ABC and King Features got letters from a lot of teachers saying thank you so much because, the Beatles music draws the kids in, and then once they're in, the sing-alongs had the words across the bottom without the bouncing ball. I have a quote from John Lennon about that in a second, but they did learn how to read while watching the Beatle cartoons, so that was kind of cool, a cool byproduct as well.
This show actually predated Sesame Street, and that didn't premiere until late 1969.
Correct.
Yeah.
So, there were other... I can't say it's all because of the Beatles, because the bouncing ball sing-alongs were around since the 30s, 20s. But this never had a bouncing ball, and that was John's biggest complaint. He took a look at it, and he used an expletive, which I won't use, but he said you couldn't even get a bleeping bouncing ball for the money we're making, Yeah. So he was upset about that, but the teachers absolutely loved it. A little bit of a byproduct of the sing-along, which I mentioned as being naughty, was that the Beatle cartoons were on Saturday morning. And very creative boys would say to their dates, how would you like to go out with me and wake up to the Beatles cartoons in the morning. So, the sing-alongs and the cartoon in general really,
It was a pickup line.
Yeah, it was. It was a pickup thing.
The lyrics that they printed were not always completely, you could hear what was being sung and see what was written, and they didn't always match up. But I have to admit, there were some Beatle lyrics that I thought they were saying something else, and when I read them, I realized that I was wrong. So I learned a little bit from it, yeah.
It went both ways because, again, don't forget, a lot of the animators were either young and green, so to speak, in animation. They were new to animation, which is what I meant by that. But a lot of them had no clue who the Beatles were. So there were times when the animators actually had to call girls up from the street and say, who's talking, in order to put the right voices on. So, of course, the lyrics, since it had to be done, if they heard one lyric, it went on there. And it's pretty funny, if you watch the sing-alongs, you could see how many were done with different words. But the funniest sing-along to me, and I always tell this in my presentations, I cannot believe that later on they used She Said, She Said, because, 12-year-olds, 8-year-olds were going around saying, Daddy, I know what it's like to be dead. So it was kind of a little odd. When the Beatles got a little more mature in their albums, it was a little interesting with the sing-alongs.
Yeah, I might be remembering this wrong, but I think in that one, on the line, who put all those things in your head, they wrote, who put all those things in your hair.
Yeah, there were so many like that.
Right.
Plus, don't forget the sing-alongs had to be cut.
Yeah.
Even though the Beatles were really short, but they were edited so horribly.
Some of those are really jarring, yeah.
Yeah, very jarring.
Well, another positive attribute of the show was, because it's animation, they can depict the band in virtually any locale or environment that they want to. They can drop them in the jungle or the Wild West or Transylvania. They even did some episodes where someone would get hit on the head and they travel back in time. That was an appealing creative element in that they could put the band in environments that the real Beatles would never find themselves in.
Yeah, they would be in Japan a bunch of times. And they looked for locales to put them in, but it was very inconsistent, though, if I must admit, because you'd have the Beatles being four guys who weren't that big in some episodes, where they had no money, and like Thank You Girl, they had no money to go eat. And then you have some where they are the Beatles, and they're being chased every 2 seconds.
Right.
So it was inconsistent in that way.
Yeah, sometimes they'd be reacted to like they were really famous. Ooh, the Beatles are here, and sometimes they're like, who are you guys?
Who are you, exactly.